here to learn
Okay.
from your experience and learn how we can be better in the future.
Okay.
So whatever you feel you want to talk about, you can talk about, and we'll
Okay.
learn from it, and it'll be great.
Cool. I'm Charla Bokikio. So I think the shortest version of this, I think where we should go, is that my daughter died of a drug overdose 3 years ago. She was 22, and it was fentanyl. She had struggled her whole life with a variety of mental health issues. Addiction, or well, before the addiction took hold. Anxiety, depression, some OCD behaviors. Before she was 18, they were looking at like probably personality disorders, but they couldn't diagnose her until she turned 18. She also had a variety of medical issues on top of the mental health things. She developed Hep C from using a dirty needle. She had kidney infections all the time. We were in hospitals a lot in her adolescent years, not only psychiatric hospitals, but just regular old hospitals. We were in the ER multiple times. She had tried to kill herself a multitude of times. So that's my story that I think you guys are going to want to look at. Mm-hmm. I have a variety of other things I could talk about, but...
I mean, we can dig into as many of them as we have time for, right?
No, personally, I had a hip replacement last year. I had, just boring stuff. But anyway, so that's kind of the basics of the story. I don't know how much detail you guys want to go into or which part of that story you even want to delve into. I think the other part of that equation is not only am I here sort of to tell my daughter's story, mm-hmm. but like what it was like for me as her mother, not only dealing with the grief reaction from her eventual death, but just as like the caretaker through all of that, having her in and out of hospitals and all of that kind of stuff. So, I don't know. Do you have any questions here? Yeah, just off the bat?
I think we'll have a lot of questions.
Do we have a way to, so there's some stuff to go?
Well, we're sorry that you had to go through that.
Thank you.
That's tough.
Thank you. I actually ended up writing a book about it. I just published it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What's the title of the book? This is the time for a plug.
Yes.
Okay.
Right now.
My New Normal.
I've heard
about
your book.
A story of love and loss in the opioid epidemic.
I've heard about this book. Actually.
How?
I don't know.
So strange.
I
literally
my mom
just
might have
published.
told me about this just barely. I don't know.
I just published on November 11th, which was the 3-year anniversary of my daughter's death. It just so happened, like Amazon chose that day. We didn't literally. We had nothing to do with it. So anyway, since her death, I'd been writing a blog, and then I eventually turned it into the book, and I've been speaking at treatment centers and things like that about her story and trying to reduce stigma that surrounds addiction and mental health issues, mostly. Mm-hmm. But I am going back to the place. She was in a residential treatment center down in St. George for her junior year, and I'm going back to speak to them in April, to the girls that are in residence there now.
Well, congrats, that's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah.
What is the format of the book? I mean, is it kind of a chronological series of what happened?
It's a memoir mostly of... Okay. I would say it follows, it starts with the morning I found out that she was dead. And it follows my first year without her of grieving. And so there's a lot of, each chapter is just kind of a moment in time in my experience of what it was like to go through that grieving process with the flashbacks that are coming, little snippets of memory from her life. What it was like to fly back to Birmingham where she was and identify the body, all of that. I mean, I don't sugarcoat anything in the book. It's very raw and it's very honest about what it was like to love a drug addict that was your child. And then, I think the biggest message of the book or what people are telling me, what I think is in there is that the message of love, that it's, if we can just love everyone, not just our kids, but there's power in healing if we can focus on love rather than judgment. And so anyway, that's the story. I'll leave this copy for you guys if you want to share it.
Would you?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy to.
I'm sure we'd love to read it. So.
You can order your own copy on Amazon if you like.
Perfect.
But
I think
there
that's
you go.
better. That way we can support the
Yeah,
project.
Yes.
We want this to-
Yeah.
Like,
Even if you read it, you could
could
still put a review on Amazon, even if you don't buy it
Cool.
on Amazon. So anyway,
When-
enough of the book plug.
Oh, no, that was honestly great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
When did you first notice what your daughter was kind of going through and struggling with?
Now, are you talking about when did I notice like something wrong in her childhood, or are you talking about the drug path?
Just either one. I mean, it sounds like you talked about how she'd had a lot of mental health
Yeah,
issues
so-
and things.
so
Sound
I'll
like that
start-
could have been a struggle.
So I'll start with the very young stuff. I think by about the time she was 4, we started noticing these like anxious kind of OCD type behaviors that she was exhibiting. One in particular was at night, we would put her to bed and go back and check on her. Finally, she would fall asleep, but I would notice this notebook next to her bed nightstand. She had a digital clock, and it was every time from like 9:00, 9:01, 9:02, 9:03, until she fell asleep, which could be like an hour or so. That was kind of like, her dad and I were trying to figure out what to do with that. We knew that wasn't typical. I mean, I knew a good deal about child development. I was teaching young children at that time. I had always taught, and so I knew that that was not normal. So there was that. We also, about that time, that for year 4 to 5, we noticed she had developed these little tics, like she would lick her lip and then wipe it. And every time she'd lick it, it would be a wipe. To the point where she was just totally, chapped lips all around. So there were like little things like that, and it was repetitious, and of course you start to notice those over time. At first you don't think anything of it, but then you're like, okay, wait, there's a pattern here. So things like that. She was very, very much an anxious child in the separation anxiety kind of realm. Like, she did not want to be apart from me in particular. I mean, both of us, because her dad and I she was our only child, so it was all about her. We always brought her everywhere with us. So she, part of that was out of necessity because she wouldn't let me leave her, but also we wanted to be with her. But she did develop some pretty severe separation anxiety, when she got into school. Like, I guess kindergarten would have been the first year that we noticed the real issue, because, you drop your kid off at school and she's just, screaming, holding on to you. So about that time, we started to look at, like, therapy options. We found a play therapist. We didn't want to do anything major, and we didn't want to medicate her. We knew that. We were like, she's way too young for any of that. But she did see a play therapist for a little while. I'm not sure how helpful that was. Who knows? But then into her early elementary age years, she did okay. I mean, she still had some of those behaviors on and off. And I'm trying to think of the next big thing that happened. Well, I guess by 3rd grade, she was having a really hard time just in school, not academically, because she was really bright, but like behaviorally. Her 3rd grade teacher was like, she's not like the other kids. She's always at problems. She wants to talk nonstop. And I'm like, well, you just don't know how to teach her, because she's not a normally developing kid like the ones who just sit there and listen to you and then regurgitate it. Not every kid's the same, as we know. And she definitely wasn't. She was different. But so her 3rd grade teacher was like, well, we need to test her for everything. She was convinced there was something really wrong with her, but she didn't know what it was. I think she thought she had like a learning disability, to tell you the truth. But so she did. So they brought us all into the principal's office, and the school counselor was there, and So anyway, we're like, okay, sure, test her, do whatever you need to. So they did IQ testing. They did. I don't even know what all tests they did. There's probably some battery of tests that these teachers do. And so about a week later, when the results came back, we're sitting there in the principal's office, and the teachers and the counselor, and they're like, well, she's got a really high IQ. She's just kind of like blew us off the chart on a lot of these standardized tests. So, they just kind of threw their hands up. They're like, she clearly doesn't have a learning disability. There's really nothing wrong with her. She might be somewhere on that ADHD, spectrum somewhere. They didn't know. So with that, we were like, okay, now what do we do? I think the teacher just had a problem with her because she was harder to deal with, She required a good bit of attention. So she somehow muddled through the rest of her elementary school years. And then when it was really middle school when social pressures started to get really hard, and her depression and anxiety just kind of went into a tailspin. And I mean, it's all right there before adolescence anyway. I think just it's a hard time for anybody. But one day, she must have been 12, I think, 11 or 12, probably 11. Her friends at school texted me from school and said, when you pick up Cassidy today, we're really worried about her. And I was like, okay, what's going on? They said, she's been cutting herself. And so I had no idea. So I picked her up from school that day, and she sat in the car, and I kind of said, hey, your friends told me that you might have something you want to talk to me about. And she pulled her sleeves up, and it was just a mess. So that was the beginning of like that more outward kind of, hey, I'm really hurting here, and I need somebody to help. And she really did want help. She was panicked. I mean, she didn't even know what was happening. So we took her to a therapist. She was already seeing a therapist on a regular basis at that point, just kind of weekly. They were trying her. I think they had put her on Strattera at that point. But anyway, that therapist suggested that she go to an adolescent psych unit for a few days. And so that's what we did. And that was her first inpatient. And then it just kind of, there's more to the story, but I don't know if you guys want to, if there's any questions that are cropping up, I don't want to just bulldoze my way through the story. You know what I mean? So
So far, it's been fantastic.
Okay.
Don't worry.
Okay,
Yeah, it's been
good.
really good.
Okay.
Yeah, you can tell as much as you want.
All right,
We'll
yeah.
chime in if we have questions.
Okay, yeah, if there's anything that needs to be
So far, I think we're just a little bit
clarified.
activated, so
Okay.
I would keep going.
Well, I've told the story so much now. When I speak, I end up telling a lot of the story, not all these details.
Well, actually, I actually, the last question I just thought of it. So, as your daughter was going through this super hard experience, what kind of self-reflections were you having? What were you thinking about yourself, and
Oh,
how
my
were you
gosh.
processing this?
Well, as a parent, you tend to blame yourself. I mean, I certainly did. What did I do? Have I not been there enough? Am I emotionally unavailable? You just start to question everything about your parenting. And her dad and I, oh gosh, this was after, okay, so when Cassidy was 8, her dad and I got divorced. He had a history of some substance abuse and some mental health, like depression and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. His grandmother was bipolar, so it was in his family. I had alcoholism in my family, my grandfather, so we both had a little bit of this. So we divorced when she was 7 or 8. 7. Sorry, these are not important details, but it's funny how when you're telling a story, you want to get it right. She had a really hard time with the divorce, obviously. Although it was fairly chaotic in our house when Mom and Dad were together, because it was not a good relationship. It was very emotionally abusive, and he never was physical, but there was a lot of manipulation. He probably had some narcissistic personality traits. He never really got the appropriate help to ever get a diagnosis for any of that stuff while we were married back then. So I think that piled on even more guilt when she was going through a lot of these other things that, okay, now she's from a broken home, you just keep questioning yourself. But we got back together 2 years after we were divorced. We remarried each other. He went to rehab. He had a coke problem. He went to rehab for 3 months. he was a successful lawyer. The law firm said, go get help, come back when you're ready. He turned his life around, everything was looking great, and so we kind of just fell back into a relationship. And that was wonderful for Cassidy. She was like, it was her dream come true, that mom and dad could get back together. But there was still, so I think in my mind, I'm like, okay, everything's fine now. The family's back together, we have our dog, it's perfect. But it was, a year or two after that she started cutting and had all these other issues that just kept getting more and more serious. So yes, I blamed myself.
So up to that point, had you had any serious interactions with like the healthcare system surrounding this problem? Or, it sounds like this was eventually what kind of threw you into that arena.
Yeah, she was seeing a therapist when she was starting to cut. And that was just your typical psychotherapist. Her pediatrician was the one that was prescribing the Strattera. And the therapist came off of a recommendation from her pediatrician that was noticing some of these anxiety issues, and she felt like she needed some help. So that we had already started into that mental health care kind of model, but it wasn't as in your face as it was when we were in inpatient with her. That was pretty extreme. It seemed, gosh, I remember even then just the stigma around her being in an inpatient psychiatric unit, an adolescent. It was like, we didn't tell hardly anybody. Because you're ashamed. You don't want people to know. You don't want them talking. We didn't want her peers to know. But of course they knew. She was gone for like a week. And I think it was the interesting thing about that first week that she spent in that psychiatric unit was that how well she did in that environment. It was like, okay, all of a sudden she has 24/7 support medically and emotionally, and she kind of needed that. And so that was a kind of a wake-up call for me that, I don't know if I'm adequate to take care of her. I think I always had in my mind back then that, this is going to be temporary. All of this stuff is just temporary. Eventually, she's going to be fine. She's going to heal. We're going to get past this. I had no idea back then what was still ahead for her. There's no way I could have. But it's like everything that happened after that was just it was just ramped up. So after she got out of the psych unit, she was in an intensive outpatient program, an IOP. So she was going every day after school. She would go to this place, and they would do group therapy. They had, it was okay. It was as good as they could have been. I think back then, this was in, early 2000s, they just didn't know better, It's like they just kind of throw this treatment plan at everybody and don't really look at how to make it individual, or, I don't know. I don't know what the right thing would have been, but I just know that it felt like a one-size-fits-all kind of plan. But it was better than anything else we had. So she kind of got bored of the IOP after a while, but she did finish it and then went back to kind of just normal life. She was seeing her therapist once a week and back to school. Later, I found, I didn't know it at the time, but about that time, she said she started to experiment with some substances. Like, some of her friends had access to alcohol pretty easily. We always had wine and beer in the house, but we didn't have like bottles of vodka sitting around. You know what I mean? Like kind of just easy access to harder stuff. But she would, go to spend the night with a friend, and I found out later, they were getting into mom's liquor cabinet and finding her mom's pills, whatever they could find, raiding medicine cabinets, just trying something to see what it felt like, which is fairly typical adolescent stuff, I think, we all kind of experiment with something at some point in our lives, I think. Maybe not everybody. But so early on, she was experimenting in that way with substances. And I think what she said, when she got into treatment later, and a lot of this came out, she was talking about the fact that she was always the more extreme of all of her friend group. You know, some of the girls would be like, okay, I'll have like one little shot of vodka, and then they're like drunk for the night. You know, these are 12-year-olds, 12, 13-year-olds. And Cassidy had said that for her, she would just push every limit, and she would want more and more and more. And there was something about any of those substances that just really made her feel good, better than some of her other friends. And so I think that just made her behavior at home get even worse. She still struggled with cutting even after the outpatient stuff. She just got better at hiding it. I'm trying to think of other things that happened before. Oh, there were, I don't know, kind of troublesome boyfriends that came in and out of the picture when she was maybe a little bit older, 14, 15. And then I think this was the first time. So she had gotten involved with this boy. It was a strange relationship because she didn't really want to tell us how old he was, but he looked young. He looked like her age. She was 15. But she was really, like, she would dodge questions about his age. And she'd never really wanted to hang around us that much when he was in the picture, so she would really kind of disappear as long as she could. I mean, we had boundaries, obviously, and curfews and stuff. But while she was seeing this kid, Barry, I was directing a play, and we had our opening night. Her dad was down in, we lived in Birmingham, Alabama. Her dad was down in southern Alabama on a case, so he was out of town. I was the only parent at home. I had gone out with some of the other cast members for the opening night celebration after. We were at a restaurant. And all of a sudden I hear my phone buzzing in my purse all night long while I'm trying to enjoy this meal. Finally, I look at it, and my phone has been blown up. And my husband at the time, we're not together now, but her dad, call after call after call. I finally call him back and walk outside, and he's like, "You need to get home right now. The police are at our house." And I was like, oh. So I was only a couple blocks from home. I run home. Her boyfriend had overdosed. He lived, but he had overdosed and was seizing on her bedroom floor from cocaine that they had injected. And the police got there. Obviously, when I walk in, they have a handful of drug paraphernalia they show me, and they said, "What do you want us to do?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And they said, "Well, it looks like Barry Blankenship is 19 years old. And if you say the word, we can take him in for, what was the charge? Something about endangering a minor or whatever that charge is." And I said, "Yep, please take him." So, I mean, the paramedics were there to make sure he was going to be okay, and he was. They were able to revive him, and everything was fine. And the police took him away. And Cassidy had a hissy fit, obviously. I mean, this was the first time we knew that, like, the drug use was even close to something like this. And so that, life went on, whatever. We got her into a 28-day program at the time because that's all that insurance would cover, So she went for 28 days to drug treatment to adolescent, and we didn't know what to do. The social worker called us, I think the second day she was in, and said, "I think Cassidy has something she wants to tell you." And we were like, she said, I can't really tell you what's going on because here's the messed up thing. In Alabama, there's like the HIPAA stuff. it protects, and I don't know how it is in Utah or how it's different in whatever states, but once you're 14, you are protected by the privacy with HIPAA, even where you don't have to tell parents things medically. So that was, this social worker was like, Cassidy is going to have to tell you something. And she said, and the social worker said, I think you need to keep her here longer. We're just going to say that. And we're like, well, what do you mean? She said, well, let me just put it this way. If she were my daughter and I knew what she told me, I would keep her locked up as long as I could. And we're like, okay. So finally it came out that Cassidy said that she had been experimenting with heroin and that she felt like she had a problem. And so we were like, oh no, what do we do? I mean, that was the big one that, we were out of our league. We didn't know what we were going to do. So we started doing research on programs. We knew she had so many other co-occurring conditions, so many things were going on that it wasn't just a drug problem. So we knew that it wasn't going to be enough just to keep her in drug rehab. Like, she needed a full, some kind of a program that was going to hit all of the boxes. So we just started to research while she was in the 28-day program. Still, we had some time and we were just trying to figure out what we were going to do. So we found a few programs. One which we really loved was in southern Utah, and we were in Alabama. It was in Hurricane, and it was for adolescent girls. They specialized in dialectical behavior therapy, which we really loved. We had researched it a lot, and we knew that they were having a lot of success with treating people that have things like borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder, any of these other personality disorders that are so hard to treat. But we really loved that they were doing DBT. So we called, we got her in somehow, miraculously. Of course, insurance didn't cover any of it. We had to take a personal loan out from the bank for $75,000. I mean, wow. We were desperate. We didn't know what to do. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was a lot more detail that I didn't tell you before she ended up in that last program, was that, she was in the kitchen with a butcher knife to her throat. She was cutting so bad at that time anyway, during all of this stuff when the boyfriend had OD'd on the cocaine and stuff. It was just her behaviors were out of control by that point. It wasn't just the drugs. I mean, she was threatening us. She was threatening herself. She had been with this boyfriend. They had gotten arrested for shoplifting at the drugstore. It was just one thing after another. So by the time we finally found the treatment center down in St. George, we were like, we don't care what it's going to cost. We're going to find a way to make this work, because we really knew she could not be home and she couldn't be in school. It was like we couldn't trust her. We didn't know how to, we were out of, we didn't have the tools we needed to protect her or to help her. So she didn't even come home between that 28-day program and coming to St. George. We had to sedate her to get her on the airplane because she was fighting us tooth and nail in the airport. We had to give her more Klonopin than she was supposed to have just to get her on the plane. We finally got her down to St. George. Well, we had to fly into Vegas and then drive all the way to St. George. And we dropped her off at the treatment center, Sunrise Residential Treatment Center. And there was a part of her I could see, because she had already been sober for 28 days by now, so it wasn't like she was still in withdrawal or anything like that, but she was angry at us. But there was this little glimmer I could see that she knew that this was kind of the only way, and that she really did want to get better. So we left her, and she stayed there for 8 months, and it was a really great program. And so she came home. We had transition stuff that happened. She'd have these home visits. She'd come home for a few days with different levels of, things she was able to do and stuff like that, and seeing friends or not, sometimes. But eventually, when she graduated the program, she came home and we had a follow-up plan in action, and it was all going really well. And then a few months after she got home, she found that old boyfriend, relapsed, disappeared for like a night. We couldn't find her. Finally, she resurfaced. She said she wanted to do better. So then that started the constant relapse roller coaster. And about that time, her dad and I divorced again for good. It was, yeah. And so Cassidy and I moved to LA from Birmingham. She kind of had this little crack where you could see some light come through, and she was starting to pursue some things that she really wanted to, finally. She was 18. And she found, a manager found her and wanted her to move out to LA. She was doing some acting and modeling at the time. And I didn't want her to go out by herself, but I was ready for a geographic change anyway, because I had just gotten divorced again. And I was like, I want to get out of here. So she and I went out to LA together. That was in 2012. And she told herself, I'm not going to do heroin anymore. And it took her about 2 or 3 months before she found meth out in LA. So she didn't go back to heroin, but she found other things, and then other party drugs and stuff. Again, got in with another guy. She kind of moved out of the place where we were living, and she kind of would drop off the face of the earth for a while. She ended up in the hospital there for, that's when she found out she had Hep C. She ended up in the hospital. We took her to the emergency room. She was feeling, I can't even remember the symptoms now, but they did a full battery of tests on her and kept her overnight. And the next morning, the doctor said, well, you've got Hep C. So trying to figure out what to do with that news. And then other hospital stays after that were just chronic kidney infections. Then she'd have suicide attempts were happening all the time. When the meth was involved, she would have these paranoid, drug-induced moments of, she would pick at her skin so much that, just bleeding because she thought bugs were under there. And then one night, she was at her boyfriend's, and she got so agitated and so, I don't know what was going on, but she just cut her arteries wide open on both arms up here, and then other more superficial cuts down, and ended up in the ER. They took her by ambulance. I mean, apparently the bathroom was just a kind of a bloodbath. And so I met her at the hospital, and they kept her in the psych ward for probably another week just to stabilize her. But again, it was like putting these little Band-Aids on these problems that, a week in a psych unit it's not going to fix anything, I mean, it's going to stabilize them, and that's what they're there for. But my gosh, as soon as they step outside into the world again, it's like, okay, what do I do with myself now? I mean, she had a psychiatrist that we trusted out there, and she would go as regularly as she could. They had her on some pretty good medications. She was on Zyprexa, seemed to be a really good medication for her to kind of stabilize her mood. Her psychiatrist at that time, once she turned 18, did give her a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. I still don't know if that's a complete picture of, I think there was a lot more going on, but I mean, those diagnoses are so hard, I think. It can get really complicated. But anyway, about that time, she was spiraling out of control again, and her dad said, why don't you send her back to Birmingham? She's still covered under my insurance, and I can maybe try to pull some strings and get her into a better treatment facility here rather than just doing these week-long psych unit things. So she agreed, somehow, miraculously agreed to go back to Birmingham. And about that time, I had met someone, and we were ready to move out of LA, and we ended up here. of all places. I grew up in Logan, so it was kind of home base, but I hadn't been here forever. You're from Logan?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Absolutely.
Cache
From
Valley?
the far north in Richmond.
Oh, okay. Well, I graduate of Logan High School. So anyway, so we came back to Salt Lake about the time Cassidy moved back to Birmingham. And then in 2016, well, a lot happened in the 2-year time, but she would go back to these boyfriends and find new ones that were just, and I'm not blaming them, but it was like that was her other addiction, these really bad relationships. And so, she ended up in jail for it wasn't even a drug-related charge, but it was, she was with this boyfriend, they were staying in some motel, and he had a dog that he left in the motel room for like several days or something because they were like getting high. I don't know what happened, but she ended up being the one that got arrested for animal cruelty of all things. I mean, she loved animals. She would do anything for an animal, I swear to you. But she got arrested and she ended up in jail. When she got out of jail after that stay, she would tell herself, I'm gonna turn myself around. This is it. This is the wake-up call. And so she was getting discharged, and she had arranged with some cellmate to have some friends pick her up, and she ended up in some like Breaking Bad meth house, like heroin den. It was bad. Like, she calls her dad in a panic and she's telling him that there's somebody duct taped to a pipe down in the basement, and she was terrified. She didn't know what to do. And she was probably 2 hours away from home where he was, but he dropped everything and drove out to save her. I mean, he was terrified. He didn't know. But then when he gets closer there, he starts to, I was on the phone with him the whole time that he was driving. And he said, what if this is an ambush? What if they're just trying to get me out there and steal my car and my money? I mean, he was terrified of her at that point because he didn't trust her because drugs were involved. So he told her to use her powers of manipulation to get somebody to drive her to the Waffle House from that place where she found herself. And so she did. She flirted with some guy enough so that he took her to the Waffle House where her dad could meet her in a public place and feel safe. So she gets in the car. They're driving back to Birmingham, and he said, you can't come and stay at my house. And she said, well, what the fuck am I supposed to do? I mean, she's like angry because she doesn't know what's going to happen. And he said, I've already found, there's a women's shelter I'm going to take you to, a women's homeless shelter. And he drove her up to the shelter and dropped her off. I mean, tears were streaming down his face. This is not what he wanted to do. And he said to her before she got out of the car, he said, if you can't figure out a way to have long-term recovery and get off of the drugs for good, you will be dead within a year. And she didn't make it a year after that. So she stayed in the homeless shelter for a little while. They had some pretty good programs, actually, for her. They, as much as they could. She tried to make the best of it. But then again, some ex-boyfriend would come along and say, well, just come and stay with me. And so she did, and then she gets sucked into these relationships. She finally got with another guy that is the one she was with when she died. They were even going to get married, they said. And she was trying to get her life back together. I know she was. I mean, they were kind of making this little house for themselves, and it was kind of sweet, They had a dog. And he had gotten paid one day, and they just had an idea that they wanted to use again. They both had a history of substance abuse. And he went out and picked up what he thought was heroin, and they both shot up in the bathroom. He came to at some point and kind of fell into the bathtub. He ended up breaking his arm, fell into the bathtub and went unconscious. And when he woke up later, Cassidy was next to the bathtub on her hands and knees, like with her head down, and she was dead. And he called 911, and that was that. So that was in 2016, November 11th. So there's a lot of, obviously there's a lot of details in there that I didn't get to, but that's the skeleton of the story of what we were dealing with. She did come to visit in Salt Lake the Thanksgiving before she died, or maybe 2 years before, and she was almost unbearable to be around. She was, she really wanted to come visit me, and I found out during that trip later that she had decided she was going to be clean when she came out here. She wasn't going to be using, but she literally had been using up until that time. And so she was in withdrawal the whole time she was here. She was sick. She was mean. And I told her after that visit, I said, you're not welcome back in the house. If you're using or if you're like this, I can't have you. And that was the last time she came to visit. I did go out and see her one time after that, before she died. But yeah, so it took a toll on our relationship. Obviously, it took a toll on her life. But, it's hard because I think what could have been done differently, and we were all just in survival mode, I don't know what I could have done differently. I know it wasn't my fault, but there's still that idea as a parent that we could have done more. We could have spent more money on treatment. You tell yourself all this nonsense. So, yeah.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
So I think the biggest question that I have is, you kind of prefaced this at the very beginning that, right, it seems like the biggest impediment to really making progress in these cases is this stigma and the lack of love in the treatment. And I think, obviously, us as future providers, the thing that we're most curious about is how do we make sure that this isn't a story that continues to play out over the next 2 to 3 decades? Because as it stands right now, right, that's the story that people get. There's very few opportunity, or I guess examples where we have done it right. What are things that you notice that we as a society can be doing better?
I guess it's easy to point out the things that we're doing wrong, I think knowing what to do better is the trick. It's hard. I remember going to ERs with her when she was having some kind of physical issue, like the kidney infections or whatever, and just the judgment from the ER nurses, and I get it, because they put her in a category of drug seeking. They're like, as soon as she's saying she's in a lot of pain and she wants something for it, they're going to treat her a certain way because they think the only reason she's there is to get, morphine or whatever. Gosh, I can't tell you how many times we ran into that. And I understood why they had to go that way. They can't just keep feeding these drug addicts morphine every time they walk in the ER. But it's like that treatment of these individuals that are suffering, all it does is disenfranchise them even more. It just pushes them into the fringes and tells them, you're not really worthy of us taking you very seriously because you just have a drug problem. It's like we can just put you in this little box and say that it's just a drug problem, whatever that means, rather than looking at them as a whole person. I think that's what we can do better, is to go, everyone who has substance use disorder has a story. I think that's why it was so important for me to write this book. It's like there's a story that you have no idea about. When we walk into a doctor's office, for example, or an ER or whatever, they only get this much of the story. And it's impossible to tell the whole story to every provider, right? It's like, we don't have time. You guys don't have time. So I don't know how to fix that. Maybe it's better record keeping that's shared amongst medical professionals, because the one thing that was kind of frustrating for us is feeling like you're telling the story over and over and over to every single provider that you come in contact with. And I know that it's probably that way for a reason. I'm not sure. But wouldn't it be nice to have this, like,
Exhausting.
this thing that follows you around as a human, like your story, that every medical provider has access to? Because then you know that it's not just one thing. And I'm sure that it's very rarely just one thing. But with these mental health issues, they're so complicated. So complicated. It's like, how do you even begin? I don't know the answer. I really don't. I know Cassidy did well when she was in treatment centers. But then you can't afford them. You can only afford them for so long. I think she would have been perfectly happy to be in a place like the residential treatment center down in St. George for the rest of her life, if she could have afforded it. She had a community of other really positive, wonderful people that cared about her, and they were all looking out for each other. And she had access to outdoor activities. They were hiking every day. They were outside doing stuff. She was doing yoga every day. They had horseback riding they could do. They had somebody really paying attention to dietary stuff. They had a psychiatrist that was seeing her all the time, making sure her meds were working. It's like, I think there are some people that suffer from substance use disorder that are at such a serious place that I think that might be the only thing that works, is a full-time, like, long-term treatment facility, and not just locking them up and making it, like a state-run hospital. But of course, it's not affordable. I mean, insurance, the only thing insurance paid for when Cassidy was in treatment was the psychiatrist bill. That was the only thing they would pay for, was his what he was billing. But the rest, it cost us $75,000 for that 8 months, plus all of the trips out to see her for family weekends. And I mean, it got really expensive. I don't know how we did it. I think her dad is still paying that debt off, actually. So, the stigma. I think the treatment community is trying to get better. The drug treatment community. I mean, you hear about that. I read articles, and I've been keeping up on the advocacy side of things. I mean, just the fact that the week that Cassidy died was the week that the Surgeon General came out for the first time with a report on addiction, and said, addiction is not a character flaw. It's not a moral failing. It is a chronic brain disease. That's the first time that a Surgeon General had said that. To me, that blew my mind, but it was so important to hear that, to have somebody say, it is a chronic brain disease. And that was when they started changing the terminology to substance use disorder from, rather than just saying addiction or addict, someone who suffers from, putting the patient first language, which I know you guys all know. But as a lay person, someone not in the medical community, I think it's really important to, for us to be educated about that kind of stuff. That's like the language, changing the language, I think is really important. Rather than even referring to, we say, and I used it when I was telling you the story, but saying that they're clean. Because if you say they're clean when they're not using, then what does that make them when they are using? You know what I mean? It's like that, if we shift the language to, okay, why don't we talk about them being in remission rather than being clean? They're in remission from substance use disorder. It means they're not currently using. That's a much more palatable way to, as a person who loved someone who suffered from that, and I can't imagine if Cassidy had someone talk to her in those terms, it could have been a game changer. Even the little language change. So maybe that's something that can be done better.
That was super insightful. Yeah. Like you said, that we all know that, But it's so easy to forget that because
Yeah.
you slip into that,
Absolutely.
especially that very
Yeah.
sterile clinical talk, and
Yeah.
so that was super helpful.
And
Thank
I know
you.
there's only so much that the doctors can do. I mean, you guys, when you are practicing, I'm sure you'll find out that you don't have that much time to spend with patients. You know, the nurses are the ones that are going to spend the majority of the time bedside with these people or in the office. You know, the doctors come in and it's all, you know, down and dirty. And I don't know that there's a way to change that. I just, as someone on the other side, I've noticed that more and more. It seems like more and more now that the nurses are sort of taking over as the real FaceTime people that you got as a patient. But
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So like going through the cycle of like remission and then relapse
Mhm.
and that, was there a point where you realized that maybe like she wasn't able to be saved and you just had to, like, how did you come to terms with that?
I don't know if I really came to terms with it until she
Yeah.
died, but there was, I do remember when she moved back to Birmingham after we were in California, and kind of that, when I wasn't living with her anymore, it was a little easier to step away and kind of say, okay, I know I have no control over this. And seeing her, hearing at that point the stories secondhand rather than experiencing them with her, like when she got out of jail and going to the homeless shelter and all that kind of stuff. I think at that time is when I really, inside, I thought, you know what, I don't know if she's going to make it through this. And I remember telling my now husband, you know, saying, I'm afraid I could get the call any day. And I have to be ready for that. Like, I remember ramping myself up and kind of emotionally safeguarding myself to go, I've got to be okay with this. I have to be ready for that call because it could happen. And it eventually came. And I don't know how ready I was. I guess, I don't know. I think I was maybe more ready than some people are because I had already gone there in my head a little bit. Yeah. And I think I probably did pull away from her emotionally in the last year because I was kind of trying to protect myself. You know, I mean, I interact with her and I loved her, but there was like that part of me that was like, gotta protect myself. Gotta have the bubble wrap a little bit. And I think she knew that she wasn't going to live to be very old. She always used to talk about that when she was younger, like a young teenager. That idea that she didn't think she was long for this world, kind of that idea. She lived really hard and she lived huge for her 22 years. And then she was gone. I hope I mean, I don't know what happens after you die, but the only thing you can hope as a parent is just that the pain's gone, you know, because I know she suffered a lot. It's so much easier now to look back and say, she had a disease, you know, rather than when you're in the middle of it, it's really difficult to have that kind of non-judgment. Because, yeah, I think I was a little hard on her, judgment-wise. You know, you go for the punitive stuff at some point. You think, well, if you can just punish it out of them. You can just take away enough stuff and it'll be so unpleasant that they'll just have to stop. But it's not the way it works. I have so many parents, especially people who've read the book or heard me speak or whatever, that have said, well, what advice can you give to parents who have kids that are going through this? And I'm like, mine didn't survive. I couldn't even keep mine alive, so I don't know what kind of advice I have to give to people. But I think like I said, maybe the advice is just love more and just stop judging them. You know, really, one thing I had talked about a lot when I speak is that the idea that if we as parents have someone who is suffering from diabetes, for example, or even a child who has cancer, do we judge them? Do we tell them it's their fault? Do we get angry at them because they might have some behavior that, you know, follows that diagnosis? No, we try to get appropriate treatment. We do everything we can to help them. We love them all the way till the end. and we try different medications, we try different treatment options. If one thing isn't working, we go on to the next. And I think we tried to do that with Cassidy, but maybe not in with that same idea, you know? Mm-hmm. I think if we can start treating people who are suffering from SUD the same that we do as people who have these other chronic illnesses, I mean, nurses don't shame people who have diabetes when they come into the ER, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of I think it's, yeah. I would like for people to know that.
I just want to take a brief pause out of consideration of your time just to make sure that you don't need to go. Mm-hmm. I think we have a lot of good stuff, but I think we also have a couple more questions.
I have time.
Okay, I just want to make sure
I don't have to be back home until 7. I have a student at 7 o'clock, so.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we weren't starting to sneak into.
No, you're good. If you have more stuff you want to.
We do.
Okay.
So I just thought it was fascinating. I mean, when you walked through the door, none of us would have ever guessed the story that you're about to tell us. And I was kind of beforehand, I was trying to guess maybe what you would talk about. Maybe it was like a cancer diagnosis or an autoimmune disorder or something like that. I don't think anyone could have guessed what it was that you were going to share. And I feel like I think that's a good thing, right? Everyone has a story that we're not really aware of, and as they get their chance to share it, you kind of enlighten people. I was just wondering, what are some of the high points now as you look back on her life? Because you seem to be, I mean, it's obviously really hard, but you seem to be pretty positive about it. You've shared it with people, trying to make an impact. So what are the high points for you as you look back? And
I think, you know, obviously there are so many positives about her life and our time together. Before I say that, though, at this point, I've shared the story so much publicly, and I've written so much, and really processed a lot, that I think it's easier for me to kind of compartmentalize a little bit and kind of set the emotions aside a little bit. So yeah, I can see how it kind of sneaks up on you that, oh, you think this woman has her stuff together and, that everything's wonderful. And then she comes and goes, hey, my daughter died on the bathroom floor of a fentanyl overdose. So, but no, I mean, obviously, I think some of my favorite memories of Cassidy as a kid were like traveling. We would travel a lot. We would usually stay in North America, we'd go to Canada and stuff. But ski trips, we would go to Canada a lot to ski. She was a snowboarder, and her dad and I were skiers. So tons of really great memories of that. We'd go to the beach all the time. We lived just 3 hours from the Gulf shores in the Gulf of Mexico, down by, where Alabama and Florida meet down on the beach. Wonderful time. And those were the best times because they were always really positive and not filled with the angst. And, I think everyone was on their best behavior when we were on vacation, even her dad, he was always wonderful. But the other thing I loved about Cassidy was that she loved to perform like me, she kind of followed in my footsteps as an actor. And she always, I think she wrote a little, it's actually included in the book. I put it in there. I had found a paper we shared a laptop for a while in California. And after she died, I was kind of cleaning out the laptop a little bit. And I found a paper she had written for school. They wanted her to write her story so far, kind of almost like an autobiography, but in a narrative form in third person about herself. And so I included that paper in the book in one of the chapters, but it's her story of her, and she talks about how when she found theater, that she felt like everything was going to be better, I just hate that it wasn't enough. Wouldn't it be great if there was some just fix that wasn't pharmaceutical that could have just taken care of all of the pain? But, I mean, she definitely said that those kinds of things helped, I cherish every moment that she wasn't suffering. Because there were lots of times during her life, many years, where it wasn't all doom and gloom. She was beautiful. I mean, she was obviously a gorgeous girl. She could have done anything. I think the hope, when I saw her have hope after she was in treatment for so long, that was my favorite time with her, because she seemed so healthy. Like, physically she looked healthy. Her eyes were bright again. She was talking about the future in a way she'd never done before. So I think I cherish those little moments, and I just kind of like want to bottle them and keep them right here, because those are pretty special. Yeah, hope. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that did. Thanks.
So one of the things we've kind of explored this year is kind of like the catharsis that comes with being able to put an experience like this into like not even necessarily a tangible product, but right, like being able to express it through a painting or writing or even like a production. Like how do you feel about this book now that it's done? Like, what does that mean for you and your ability to recover from these experiences?
I think it's been really important, actually. As soon as she died, 2 months after she died, I started writing. And I never considered myself a writer. That was not my medium of choice, like to express myself usually. As an actor, I just want to act. I want to feel it. But I just started putting some ideas down, or I'd get my phone on my notes app and just start to like jot down stuff as I was experiencing them, because it was like there was a part of me that thought, okay, I don't want to forget these emotions that I'm feeling, and I don't want to forget these thoughts and memories that I'm having about what this has been like for me since she died, but also ideas about her life that I didn't want to forget. So I was just writing and writing and writing, and then in January after she died in November, so it was January after, I had an idea to start a blog. So I thought, okay, I'm just going to start putting some of this stuff into this blog. And I'd never been a blogger before. I had to look up how to make a blog. I was like out of my league. So I figured it out and had like a WordPress thing. And so I started sharing those little snippets in blog form. And at the year mark, after she died, I kind of felt like I was done writing. I reached this kind of epiphany, and I was done. I felt like I had healed a little bit. I mean, I knew that the grief process wasn't over and that I'd always have this, but I felt like I was just done with that writing part of it. So I stopped writing in the blog, and I had so many people contact me saying, you really need to make this into a book. You need to share it in a bigger way. And so last year is when I started to go, oh, maybe I should. At first I thought, well, I'll put all of this experience into a one-woman theatrical show. That seemed like a more natural thing that would happen from my experience. But when I really started to think about what that would mean, I was like, oh no, I don't know where to start with that, or even the thought of reliving that to that emotional level in a one-woman show, night after night if I'm performing or touring or whatever. So I kind of put that on the back burner, and then the book idea came again. So finally I just went, you know what, I have all the material. I just need to kind of rearrange it and edit and stuff like that. And so I hired an editor, and they helped me, and I just self-published and did it. And it has been remarkably therapeutic for me. Not only just getting it out of me, but the impact I'm seeing with people who are reading it and the people that have been listening when I've spoken at the treatment centers and things. These people that are suffering from some of these things are coming up to me and saying, I had no idea the impact that it would have on my parents. Mm-hmm. And that was the least that I never expected that kind of reaction. I just wanted to share the story, but it's interesting what people are connecting with. I've even had people who have no attachment at all to anyone who's suffered from substance use disorder. They've somehow been in a bubble their whole lives. And they still said, this is not a book for someone who's, not just a book for someone who's grieving or has gone through something like this, but it's they said it's a handbook for how to live mindfully. that it's like reminding us that if we are paying attention to every moment, we can find something to be grateful for, rather than, ruminating over past hurt and living in the muck of grief. It's like, no, we have a choice. We can actually decide to connect with other people, and we can be grateful, and we can take a big breath and say, I'm okay right now. And it's okay to be okay. The last chapter in the book is called It's Okay to Be Okay. I really had to tell myself that at some point. It's okay to not be okay sometimes, but it's also okay for me as a grieving mother to be okay, to heal. I don't think Cassidy would want me to be, in my bed with the covers over my head, just crying all the time. She probably enjoyed that, watching that for the first few weeks after she died. But I joke. She had a really good sense of humor, so she would have appreciated that. But anyway, yeah, it's been really helpful to get it out and to have people hear the story.
Thank you so much.
Nothing else? Okay.
Just think, thanks,
Yeah,
yeah. Marshall
Oh,
said
gosh,
it
of
times like,
course. Yeah.
very cool that first year medical school we get to, I don't know, have these kind of experiences, because I don't think otherwise
No.
we would.
Yeah.
At other places we wouldn't, and so.
Yeah.
I feel like for me, the next time that we see someone who's going through this, our mind will come back to this rather than go to another place.
I
So
like that.
we're very grateful that you
Thank
were
you.
open about it, because the next time I see someone, I'll be like, this is someone's daughter. There's more than just one box.
I like
so
that.
We're grateful that you
Thank
snapped
you.
us out of that.
Oh, I appreciate
Before it
that.
happened. So.
No, I'm really
We're-
glad that
yeah.
if that is the case, with just one patient, that would be worth it.